I was 5 minutes late. Not hours, not even double digits. Just 5 minutes into a morning stand-up that I'd already stabilized half the system for, while everyone else was still yawning into their lattes. My hands still smelled like server dust and adrenaline. I'd been in the server room all night rerouting a manual load transfer because a patch someone approved without testing had sent our latency through the roof. No acknowledgement, no thanks, just the sound of my boots on tile and Jenna's voice cutting through the air like a buzzer. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," she called out, syrupy and sharp. "Late again? Must be nice." Laughter rippled through the room. A few teammates snorted into their coffee. One guy I'd mentored years ago couldn't even meet my eyes. I didn't flinch, didn't stop walking. Just took my seat at the edge of the table, opened my laptop, and resumed the very same system health script I'd used to keep their entire build from crashing 7 hours ago. The ones they now called outdated. Hey, quick pause before we go further. If this story resonates with you, or if you've ever been dismissed for doing your job too well, do us a favor, hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of you watch without subscribing, but it really motivates our whole team to keep these stories coming. Now, back to Jenna. She strutted to the whiteboard like she'd designed it herself, waving around one of those pastel dry erase markers that squeaks when overused. She didn't talk strategy, didn't reference architecture or trace dependencies. She talked branding, headcount, elevated energy in workflows. It was all noise, all show. She wore chaos like a blazer and expected the rest of us to treat it like couture. What she never seemed to grasp, what none of them did, was that under all that slick presentation polish was a crumbling back end held together by patches, fallbacks, and proprietary logic trees I'd developed during the early years. Code no one else had read in full, logic no one else could replicate. But to them, I was the legacy problem, the analog solution in a digital-first org. When she took over, Jenna made it her mission to rebuild everything. Modular cloud solutions, she kept saying, modernize the stack. She wanted to migrate, reinvent, rip, and replace, all with no sense of what those systems were built on. She authorized the overhaul 2 weeks into her role without asking where the encryption keys were, or who maintained them, or what kind of licensing framework was wrapped around the pipelines. She never asked about ownership, because she didn't believe I owned anything. That was her first mistake. The second came days later, when one of her new hires, a guy who liked calling himself solutions architect, even though he once thought Git was a snack food, flagged my scripts in a code review. Non-standard format, he wrote. Deprecated methods. Suggest full refactor. Non-standard. Right. Because I built them from scratch. Because they weren't plug-and-play, off-the-shelf, open-source trash. They were hardened systems. Layered, encrypted, and registered under a legacy clause from our Series B that protected contributor-created IP under unauthorized trust. I didn't advertise that. I didn't need to, but I kept logs, metadata, chain of custody trails, signature headers built into the script shell. Still, Jenna signed off on the overwrite request without blinking, told the team to phase out the old stuff, meaning me. They didn't know what they were deleting. They didn't even know what they were accessing. But it didn't stop them. I remember watching the commit logs roll in, watching them try to fork what they thought was unsecured code, watching the alerts ping in my inbox like slow, predictable rain. Unauthorized duplication attempt, key mismatch, fallback activated. That last one always made me smile. They thought they were modernizing. They were poking a sleeping system with a stick. Then came Tuesday night. I stayed after hours because I saw the latency spike before it hit. One of the new services they bolted on bypassed a validation layer and was about to corrupt live transactional data. Jenna's team didn't catch it. They were too busy building their own dashboards. I could have let it burn, could have walked away. But that's not how I'm wired. I dug in, rebuilt the failover path, created a new manual token stream, balanced the load with 2 proxy nodes no one had touched in years. System stable by 3:11 a.m., I left a single note in the log. Resolved, legacy fallback activated, RS. No one responded, not until 9:04 a.m. when I walked into that room, 5 minutes late and entirely out of thanks to give. Jenna's smirk was already halfway formed when a quiet voice from the back of the room spoke. Actually, she's early. You're all just late to realize what's about to hit. I turned. The janitor stood in the corner, except he wasn't holding a mop, and he wasn't wearing his usual uniform. He pulled off the gloves, took off the cap. "I'm Arlen Goff," he said, voice calm and even, CEO of Axiom Dynamics. The room went silent. Jenna didn't move. Arlen looked at me and nodded once. Thanks for staying late last night. Now, let's talk about ownership. They flagged it during a code audit sprint, some rushed initiative Jenna launched to streamline back-end variability. A young dev named Brandon, fresh from a coding boot camp that treated Python like gospel, submitted the ticket. I saw it come through the internal system around 11:46 a.m. Subject: non-standard pipelines, legacy scripts. The body was one paragraph long. Recommend refactor or deprecate. Unclear logic flow, obfuscated structure, undocumented encryption keys, source unknown. Source unknown. I stared at the screen for a long time after that line, not because it upset me, but because it confirmed everything I already suspected. They didn't read the logs, they didn't follow the threads. They saw layered recursive function chains and assumed it was messy. They didn't understand it, so they thought it was broken. The irony? That same code had saved their infrastructure 3 times in the last 18 months. Jenna knew that. She just didn't care. To her, everything before her tenure was legacy clutter, a political liability. She wasn't interested in who wrote it, only that it didn't fit the new brand aesthetic. Cloud-based, modular, AI-augmented, containerized for future agility. They threw buzzwords around like confetti. It didn't matter whether anything worked, just that it looked good in a quarterly roadmap slide. So when Jenna signed the ticket, greenlit a full deprecation effort across the old pipelines, I didn't argue. I didn't send a Slack message or jump into a meeting or forward any of the version history that would have taken 5 seconds to pull. I simply sat back in my chair, opened my encrypted backup repo, and clicked watch. Because here's what they didn't know. I'd licensed those scripts years ago. Right after Series B, when the founders were desperate to lock in engineering retention without bloating payroll, they offered us what they called the Contributor Trust Framework, a quiet little clause bundle that let you register IP through a shared licensing structure, one that defaulted to personal ownership unless explicitly signed away. They wanted loyalty, I wanted legal clarity. So I registered every line I touched, every node, every fallback system, not just the core automation framework, everything it touched, influenced, supported. I documented it obsessively, time-stamped headers, commit ID chains, notarized logs backed up in a third-party repo outside the Axiom umbrella. They thought they were deleting code. What they were actually doing was duplicating licensed property without authorization. What they called cleaning house was, on paper, software piracy. And it gets better. The encryption keys weren't just strings, they were living tokens, programmed to regenerate every 7 days based on biometric access from a verified user. That user? Me. Which meant every attempt to fork the logic failed unless routed through my signature path. They couldn't even duplicate the pipeline tree without triggering an alert. It was like watching toddlers try to hotwire a car by jiggling the steering wheel. By Wednesday, the errors began stacking. Silent failures first, back-end delays, cascading timeouts, soft crashes in data ingestion services. The team thought it was a server issue. Brandon blamed cloud latency. Jenna told the board we were scaling through some early turbulence. No one considered the simplest truth. They'd broken a system they didn't understand, one I hadn't just written, but designed to protect itself from exactly this kind of reckless tampering. I stayed quiet. I watched my old logic kick in as it was supposed to. Fail-safes, fallback modules, watchdog alerts. One by one, my embedded markers lit up like trail lights on a foggy road. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered. Layered token walls, redirect nodes, automated pings to the license log every time a key mismatch occurred. And they still didn't ask. Not once. Not where the code came from. Not what it was licensed under. Not who maintained the original deployment pathway. They just kept rewriting, reformatting, rebranding. They kept painting over steel with acrylic and wondering why it wouldn't hold. Then I saw the commit Jenna approved. Her initials in the merge request for the final rollback of the remaining legacy fallback paths. And I knew it was time. I walked to the far side of the office, pulled my archived documentation drive from the drawer, and scanned the files one more time. License registrations, contributor clauses, time-stamped ownership chain, copies of every contract signed between 2017 and 2021, including one delicious little clause added in October 2019. Intellectual property contributed under the contributor trust framework shall remain the property of the registered contributor unless A, explicit transfer is signed by both parties, and B, such transfer is recorded in the company's IP ledger. In the absence of both A and B, the contributor retains sole rights. They had neither. There was no transfer, no record, and now their entire platform was sitting on top of proprietary software they didn't own and couldn't replicate. I exhaled slowly, not in anger, not in satisfaction, just clarity, a kind of still absolute understanding. They were walking straight into the storm, and I didn't need to lift a finger. The code would do it for me. The spike came in hot, barely caught by the fallback monitors before it could tip over into catastrophic territory. At 3:08 a.m., the East Coast node tried to process a malformed call from an outdated API endpoint Jenna's team had failed to sunset. The request bounced, then duplicated, then pinged a deprecated loop that hadn't been validated in weeks. I watched it happen in real time. Latency tripled, load spiked, and the dashboard started bleeding red across every environment like a time-lapse wound. If it had hit production, we would have lost data integrity across 6 client zones in under 90 seconds. There was no one else watching. No alerts went to Jenna's team. They were asleep, heads full of clean slides and weekend offsites. But I was there, logged in, 3 monitors glowing soft blue in the dark, thermos half empty, watching the warning flicker across the command line like a whisper in a storm. I didn't panic. I activated a dormant proxy route I hadn't touched in 18 months. It rerouted the traffic, locked out the malfunctioning endpoint, and sandboxed the corrupted requests in an isolated environment for manual review. I stabilized the latency, rebalanced the load, and manually generated 2 time-stamped reports, one for the system log and one for myself. Both included every failed call, every error trace, and, most importantly, the exact location of the pipeline logic they had tried to overwrite. By 4:12 a.m., the system was stable again. By 4:47, I had finished the rollback and left a comment in the deployment thread. Resolved. Legacy fallback activated. RS. No one responded. No one noticed. So I went home. Slept for 90 minutes, took a lukewarm shower, put on the same navy hoodie I'd worn the night before, and walked back into the building, badge barely registering under the fluorescent lights. My heart didn't race. I wasn't nervous. I was just tired. Bone deep, system-level tired in a way I hadn't felt since the early years of the company when we built with urgency, not ego. At exactly 9:04 a.m., I walked into the stand-up, 5 minutes late. Jenna looked up, stylus in hand, and cocked her head with theatrical exaggeration. "Late again?" she said, loud enough for the whole room. "Must be nice." She chuckled. One of her junior leads snorted. The guy with the boot camp badge half smiled behind his keyboard. The room started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because they knew the script. Ridicule the quiet one. Reward the voice with the microphone. I stood still. Didn't sit. Didn't speak. I was about to open my laptop when a calm voice cut through the room, slicing the laughter in half like glass falling off a table. "Actually, she's early." I turned slowly. So did everyone else. "You're all just late to realize what's about to hit." The voice came from the back of the room, near the exit. A man stood there, older, maybe late 50s, graying temples, neat build, soft eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses. He wore a maintenance jacket, black gloves. A cart sat beside him with neatly folded rags and a utility case, except he wasn't holding a mop. He wasn't wiping counters. And in one slow movement, he peeled off the gloves and dropped them onto the cart. "I'm Arlen Goff," he said, voice measured and precise. "CEO of Axiom Dynamics." Dead silence. Chairs didn't creak, keyboards didn't click. Even Jenna froze, stylus suspended in midair like it had forgotten what it was for. Someone near the back actually blinked and whispered, "Wait, what?" But Arlen ignored it. He stepped forward. No entourage, no presentation, no need for spectacle, just presence. He walked past the whiteboard Jenna had scribbled her cloud migration roadmap on, past the useless diagrams and bullet point nonsense she loved to wave around like scripture, past the team that had spent the last 3 months trying to erase what they didn't understand. He stopped 2 feet from me. "Thanks for last night," he said simply. "Without the fallback you built, we would have lost everything tied to the Westar rollout." Jenna's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Arlen turned toward her. And you authorized the code-based rollback? Her eyes flicked left, then right, like a trapped animal scanning for exits. We were standardizing the pipeline. It was non-compliant. Legacy code. Arlen raised an eyebrow. Non-compliant? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder. Old school, paper. I think legal's about to have a different opinion. The room felt like it had tilted. Jenna tried to speak again, but the moment was gone. Arlen turned back to me and said, "Would you mind joining me upstairs after this?" He didn't ask. He didn't command. He simply invited. And somehow, that felt louder than anything Jenna had ever barked across a conference room. I nodded once. Arlen looked at the rest of the room, at the faces that had been laughing minutes ago, now dead silent. Then he said it, clear, calm, cold. "We're going to have a conversation about intellectual property and theft." Then, quieter, almost an afterthought. "Yours." Security approached fast. 2 uniformed guards flanking the HR liaison, each one wearing that bland expression corporate trains into them. One held a badge scanner, the other held out his hand. "We'll need your key card," he said, like this was just a routine equipment check and not the start of an offboarding sequence. Jenna leaned back in her chair, practically radiating smugness. She didn't even try to hide it. Her smile was lazy, almost casual, but her eyes were locked on me like she'd already written the final sentence of her internal victory memo. I didn't move, not out of fear, but because Arlen hadn't moved either. He glanced at the guard's outstretched hand, then lifted one finger. A calm, deliberate gesture. "Wait," he said softly. "One more thing." Everyone paused. The room's tension pulsed like static before a lightning strike. Arlen didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Even the guards looked at him now like they weren't sure who they were supposed to be taking instructions from, which was telling because the only people in the company who still remembered what the CEO looked like were the ones who read contracts instead of company newsletters. Arlen turned to Jenna. "Before we do anything else, he said, "we need to talk about code ownership." It hit her like a blunt object. You could see it. Her smirk cracked. Not visibly, not cartoonishly, but microscopically. A flicker in her eyes, the smallest clench in her jaw. She shifted in her seat and forced a laugh, but no one laughed with her. "Excuse me," she said. "The code was internal. We've already migrated." Arlen tilted his head. "You think internal means unprotected?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the corner where one of the DevOps team leads was still at his laptop, hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. "Pull the audit logs," Arlen said. "Legacy script tree, last 60 days. Include fallback routing attempts and license alerts." The room held its breath. Kieran, the DevOps lead, started typing. Fast. His fingers flew across the keys like this was a red team exercise and he was trying to win a prize. His screen mirrored on the conference display behind him. Rows of system logs began to populate. The first page showed 27 failed access attempts. The second showed 6 instances of redirected traffic from unauthorized deployment paths. Then came the headers. System notice, license alert, unauthorized duplication attempt, script mismatch, key signature invalid, licensing redirection activated, and finally, the one that made Jenna lean forward involuntarily. Contributor framework breach alert, IP flag triggered, encryption fork rejected, fallback restored. Kieran stopped typing. "These weren't just red attempts," he said quietly. "They tried to copy the logic, not just access it, duplicate it." One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. Arlen's gaze never left Jenna. "You authorized this migration?" I signed off on the standardization plan," she said, voice suddenly tight. "It was a modernization effort." "But you didn't check the script headers?" "There weren't any listed." "They were embedded," I said, finally speaking. Every head turned. The script headers were signed, encrypted, and registered under the Series B Contributor Trust Framework, I continued. Clause 14-C. Protected contributors retain ownership unless transfer is documented and registered in the IP ledger. Silence. Then Kieran again, almost whispering now. "She's right. There's a chain of custody trail on every file. It links back to her account. Time-stamped. Notarized." Jenna's face drained. She turned to HR, then to the legal liaison who had just entered the room with a folder labeled "Internal Use Only" in bright red lettering. But no one moved to support her. They just watched, waited. because the moment had shifted irreversibly. Arlen stepped forward. Tell me something, Jenna. Did you check the contributor license index before ordering a complete rollback of the scripts? No answer. Did you even ask who owned the encryption keys? Still nothing. Because she hadn't. Because she never thought ownership mattered. Because to her, code wasn't architecture, it was decoration. Something you rearranged to look efficient in a quarterly update. Something you borrowed, copied, repackaged, renamed. She hadn't triggered a technical error. She'd triggered a licensing alarm, one hardwired into the system, one that pinged legal, compliance, the contributor trust log, and yes, the CEO. And now, everyone knew it. The guards lowered their arms. Arlen didn't ask for my badge. He turned to the table and spoke with quiet finality. Anyone else touch the legacy scripts? A few people shook their heads. Kieran said, "No, sir. The fork stopped at Jenna's team." Arlen nodded. Then to security. "Hold on. Collecting anything. There's a much larger issue here." Jenna stood up, finally trying to regain ground. "You can't just walk in and override protocol." Arlen looked at her like he'd just discovered a fly in his glass of wine. "I'm not overriding anything," he said. "I'm protecting the company from a pending intellectual property suit." Then he turned back to me. "I believe you have the license documentation on hand." I nodded once. 3 copies, signed, 1 notarized, 1 archived. He gave the faintest smile. "I thought so." Legal arrived within 30 minutes. 3 of them, moving fast and silent, like internal surgeons called for a late-stage diagnosis. They didn't smile, didn't shake hands, just came in with hard briefcases, neutral suits, and eyes that scanned the room before their feet stopped moving. One of them, a senior counsel named Rosalind Denning, asked only one question when she entered. "Who has the original file tree?" Kieran raised his hand. "I pulled the logs already. The fallback structure was triggered by an unauthorized duplication attempt." He tapped a few keys and pushed the audit to the main screen again. "It's confirmed. The old system activated licensing protocols on contact. Script header flagged a protected signature. The overwrite failed." Rosin nodded without even glancing at the screen. "Where's the script?" "Local backup vault," I said quietly. "I have 3 archived versions, all indexed, notarized, and hashed. One was submitted to our contributor IP ledger the same quarter the acquisition finalized." She looked at me for the first time, not with surprise, with something colder, respect maybe, or just recognition. "Can you pull up the file?" I opened my laptop and navigated to the archive. The moment I double-clicked, the room went still. On screen, a single block of code appeared. Not flashy, not colorful, just clean, efficient, the way you write something when you know it has to last. At the top was a long string of metadata in a nested block. Time-stamped, encrypted, chain-signed through a ledger that hadn't been touched since 2019. Under that, 3 words. Signed, R, Sado, followed by a unique key hash, cross-referenced with a digital notary log, and a contributor trust ID. Rosin leaned forward slightly. "Is that ID still active in the company's ledger?" "I verified it last week," I replied. "Still listed, no revocation on record." She tapped a few notes into her tablet. "Then this isn't an internal code base, it's a third-party contribution under binding license protection." Jenna finally broke. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "The code was part of our mainline environment. It was hosted on internal servers. And maintained solely by her," Roslyn cut in. "Created by her. Licensed by her, with no transfer clause executed, no override, no shared authorship, just a hard trail of provenance you didn't bother to check before your team started rewriting it." Jenna's voice faltered. "We were modernizing. You were duplicating," Rosin said flatly. She turned to the other 2 attorneys, who had already pulled up the contributor trust agreement from our Series B era. Clause 17.2, subsection A. Any system, software, or technical asset built by a protected contributor without revocation and explicit transfer shall remain the sole intellectual property of said contributor, regardless of hosting environment or team assignment, unless formally reassigned by signature and ledger confirmation. The second lawyer looked up from the document. "Was a transfer ever filed?" "No," I said. Rosin didn't even pause. "Then what happened here wasn't standardization, it was unauthorized use. Technically, intellectual property theft." You could feel the air shift, not metaphorically, physically, a kind of drop in temperature, the kind that happens when people realize they've been playing the wrong game on the wrong board with the wrong rules. Jenna didn't speak again. She didn't move. Even Kieran, who'd been sitting at a distance, stopped typing. No one wanted to be associated with it anymore. Not the scripts, not the decisions, not the fallout. Rosalind closed her tablet. Who signed off on the migration plan? Jenna's name was already on the screen. The files showed her initials at every major checkpoint. Code-based review, rollback approval, even the repository restructure. That alone, Rosalind said, is enough for the board to consider liability escalation. She bypassed legal, compliance, and IP review. She never asked, I said quietly. Jenna's head turned toward me fast. You never told anyone. I didn't need to, I replied. You had access to the ledger. You had the framework documents. You had the script. The protections were embedded in every header. Rosalind nodded. Exactly. It wasn't hidden. It was ignored. They took Jenna's laptop. They requested a forensic review of all commits her team had made in the last 60 days. Then they turned to Arlen, who had said almost nothing since they walked in. He stood with his arms crossed, staring at the screen like he wasn't seeing code. He was seeing a liability spreadsheet lighting up in red. He finally spoke. Reverse the migration, reinstate the original pipelines, and put her contract under review. He didn't have to say whose contract. Then, to me, I'd like a meeting this afternoon. Walk me through the full structure. We'll determine next steps. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Oh, and Rosalind? Yes, sir? File an internal protective notice for her scripts. Effective immediately. I want her IP shielded under top-level privilege. Jenna exhaled sharply, like someone had kicked the floor out from under her. But it wasn't a fall. It was the sound of her bluff collapsing, and everyone knew it. By Thursday, the systems were up. But wrong. No one said it out loud at first. The dashboards were green, the alerts were quiet, and the customer-facing layers hadn't melted into a crisis. But under the surface, there was a tension, like an orchestra playing a half-step off-key. Routines that used to run in minutes now stuttered through tasks. Logs showed unpredictable jitter. Token expiration cycles failed without warning. And the fallback layer, the one I'd built into the foundation years ago, it was still in control. Not because I forced it, but because they'd failed to replicate it. The new pipeline assumed default tokens, but the system expected live ones, refreshed daily, signed by the original encryption schema tied to my biometric certs. They didn't have those, couldn't generate them. Every day the system stayed live. It pinged for tokens I hadn't given them, and every day those pings failed. They didn't understand it wasn't a bug, it was design. HR called a meeting. They framed it like a debrief, but filled the room with security, legal, and 2 mid-tier engineers Jenna had once described as her operational lieutenants. Their posture made it obvious. This was a setup for a disciplinary escalation, a scapegoat session. They slid over a printed report full of red underlines and implied risk. Their lead opened with, "There are questions about the fallback logic you left behind and whether it constitutes a deliberate security compromise." I didn't answer. Because Arlen was already in the room, he didn't sit at the table, just stood by the window, looking out at the city like it bored him. Then he turned. "It's not a security breach," he said. "It's a licensing breach, and it's on us." Every head turned. Rosalind, legal counsel, stood from her chair and placed 2 documents side by side. "One is her contributor agreement," she said, "signed under the IPE contributor framework adopted after the Series B round. Her code is protected, not borrowed. We failed to execute transfer protocols." She tapped the second folder. The other is Jenna Tressler's employment contract. It includes a clause, 6B, stating that she may authorize structural overrides only with dual approval, one technical, one legal. She paused. There's no record of either approval on the code migration. You could feel the shift, not like a tidal wave, but like the tide pulling back before the crash. Control drained from the room in slow, clinical silence. The language changed too. No more talk of compliance concerns, no more posturing. Suddenly it was containment. Impact limitation. Client-facing exposure risk. I heard someone whisper the word audit into their notes. It was happening. The shift from accusation to admission. Jenna wasn't there. She hadn't shown up to stand up that morning or the one before, but her fingerprints were all over the collapse. Her signature authorized the rollback. Her Slack threads pushed the overwrite. Her voice was in the room, even if her body wasn't. And now, everyone else was left holding the weight of her decisions. It tried to argue. Can't we just reassign ownership retroactively? Rosalind didn't even look up. No. The framework doesn't allow post facto transfer. It requires active contributor signature, co-signed by legal. The ledger would flag it as tampering. Someone else tried another angle. Can't we just replace the scripts altogether? Sure, I said. If you can rebuild a decade of layered logic, encrypted routines, and live rollback triggers in time for the next quarterly compliance audit. No one responded because they couldn't, because it wasn't just about code anymore, it was about trust and structure. And the fact that for years the company had quietly relied on my invisible architecture while starving it of credit. The very systems they had tried to phase out were the only things still keeping them afloat. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After the meeting, Arlen walked with me down the corridor. "Do you have full documentation?" he asked. "Of the scripts?" "No," he said. "Of the framework, of everything they tried to overwrite, the full history." I nodded. "Yes, signed, archived, verified." He smiled faintly. "Good. I'd like a briefing tomorrow. Not just for legal, board level. They need to understand what we almost lost." I nodded again. Before he walked away, he paused. "Her clause was airtight," he said quietly. "She revoked her own rights the moment she bypassed dual sign-off." He didn't say Jenna's name. He didn't have to. She was already a ghost in the system she thought she controlled. And I was no longer the quiet technician she thought she could erase. Jenna was already talking when he walked in. Something about cross-platform visibility and streamlining vendor pipelines. Her voice carried like it always did. Clear, authoritative, more confident than correct. A few of her team sat at the long table, nodding like bobbleheads, half listening, half checking Slack. I stood just inside the doorway, out of view, still as stone. Then Arlen stepped into the room. He didn't knock, didn't ask for permission. No entourage, no clipboard, no laptop. Just him and Rosalind Denning, our senior counsel, walking in like they already knew the outcome. And maybe they did. Jenna's voice stuttered, just slightly, when she saw them. "Good morning," she said, adjusting her tone like she was trying to claim the space first. "We're in the middle of the vendor integration sync." Arlen didn't stop walking. He didn't smile, didn't even look at the others. He walked straight up to the table, paused just behind Jenna's chair, and said 5 words that cracked the air like thunder in a glass room. "She's with me," he said, nodding toward Rosalind, then toward me. Every face turned, not out of curiosity, but calculation. Some registered confusion. Others, the smart ones, registered fear. Jenna blinked. Once. Twice. Her mouth opened, but Arlen wasn't finished. He turned toward me, his voice softened a degree. "Let's talk in my office." I stepped forward, past the room of people who'd laughed on Wednesday, past the whiteboard Jenna had once used to mock my code, past the junior engineers who still had their fingers hovering over keyboard shortcuts, waiting for a signal on how to react. Arlen let the silence stretch. Then he turned back to Jenna. No expression, no drama. "We'll be discussing intellectual property theft," he said. Then, after a beat, "yours." You could have heard the server fans in the walls. Jenna stood there, jaw tight, trying to summon something. Indignation, disbelief, outrage, but nothing landed. She looked at Rosin like she expected her to say it was all a misunderstanding. But Rosin didn't even acknowledge her. She was already walking beside me, carrying a folder thick enough to end careers. We didn't speak as we left the room. There was nothing to say, because everything that mattered had already been signed, time-stamped, hashed, and entered into the ledger. In Arlen's office, the light was softer. It overlooked the south side of the building, same view I'd once sat beside during the early build-out years when we didn't have titles, just functions. Arlen gestured to a chair. I sat. Rosalind placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly. "This," she said, "is the formal pre-review summary of violations against the contributor IP framework, signed and submitted as of 7:41 this morning." She slid it toward Arlen, then turned to me. "You're listed as sole owner of the licensed modules in question. All documentation has been validated. You retain legal ownership unless explicitly transferred," which never happened, I finished. She nodded. Arlen didn't speak right away. He flipped through the files slowly, page by page, absorbing the wreckage of his own organization. When he finally did speak, it was with a kind of quiet gravity I hadn't heard in years. "You were right to document everything, Lab," he said. "I wasn't trying to be right," I said. "I was trying to keep the system stable." He nodded again. You've done more than that, he said. You've built something that outlasted 3 reorgs and 2 tech leads. You documented it when no one asked, and you protected it when they tried to overwrite it. He paused. I want your help rebuilding our internal frameworks, licensing, documentation, compliance tracking, and I want it done under your terms with oversight. I didn't nod right away. I didn't have to, because this wasn't a negotiation. This was a correction, a return, not just to title or influence, but to rightful control over what had been mine all along. Outside the office, people were whispering. They always do after power shifts, especially the quiet ones. I didn't care. I wasn't there for apologies or approval. I was there because someone finally read the license. And the law spoke louder than Jenna ever had. By Monday, her office was empty, no chairs pulled out, no coffee mug, no files stacked in defensive little towers like she used to build around herself during strategic sessions. Just a thin envelope on her desk labeled Administrative Hold Pending Review. She didn't say goodbye, didn't send a message. HR told the floor she was on temporary leave. Everyone knew what that meant. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The system had spoken. At 10:07 a.m., I was in Arlen's office again. Same chair, same folder, same low hum from the south-facing window. But this time, we weren't discussing licensing violations. We were talking growth. I slid a thin deck across the table. This is the rollout plan I proposed 2 years ago, I said. You rejected it during the Series D prep round, said it was too quiet, too operationally heavy. Arlen flipped through the pages slowly. His expression changed around slide 5. Paused, considered, then kept reading. By slide 11, he stopped. You kept refining this? He asked. I nodded. Every quarter, updated the vendor alignment, pricing models, and timeline. It's leaner now, better fit for our current structure, and fully automatable once the new scripts are stabilized. He didn't hesitate. Approved, he said. Just like that, no ego, no posturing, just recognition. He saw it now, what they all missed before. The logic, the precision, the foresight. He wasn't betting on slides anymore. He was betting on systems that had outlived the people who tried to bury them. By the afternoon, IT reinstated my original scripts, clean, uninterrupted, and untouched. Only this time, they came with something new, a dual authorship watermark. One line of code, almost invisible, embedded at the top of every file. C. R. Sato, Licensed Contributor Axiom Trust Index. It wasn't just cosmetic, it was legal, traceable, immutable. The scripts weren't just part of the system now. They were protected by it. When DevOps deployed the new update package, I watched it cascade through the environment with surgical clarity. No more friction, no more API bottlenecks. The system moved like it used to, confident, lean, controlled, not fast for the sake of being fast, just right. Later that evening, someone from infrastructure pinged me privately. Nice touch, they wrote. Never seen dual authorship in a live deployment. I replied with just 4 words. They won't forget again. Because they wouldn't. They'd mocked it once, called it clunky, outdated, analog. But now, they were building protection around it, architecting the entire recovery roadmap with one rule: don't touch her logic without review. Funny how fast reverence follows revelation. Funny how silence can echo louder than applause. And maybe that's the part they'll never understand, Jenna and her tribe of noise. They built brands. I built the thing that kept them from burning down. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not awkward, not punitive, just respectful. The kind that lingers when the balance has finally shifted and people know better than to fill the air with noise. The kind you earn. Engineers who used to roll their eyes at my comments now paused before pushing changes. They mirrored my structure, line for line, format for format. One even stopped me in the hallway and asked if I had a template for modular fallback logic. I didn't. I never had. But I said I'd draft one. He smiled like I'd offered him a personal cheat code. In Slack channels where my notes were once ignored, they now got pinned. My scripts didn't just run, they got cited. Internal documentation referenced Sato-style triggers, a name I never picked but somehow caught on. I let it slide. No one questioned the extra lines of encryption anymore. No one asked why the legacy vault was still active. They just accepted it like gravity, an invisible rule you didn't break if you valued your footing. Jenna, she resigned by the end of the week. No goodbye email, no speech, no handoff, just a quiet HR memo saying her role had transitioned. Her name vanished from the org chart like a redacted line in a classified file. A few loyalists blinked, unsure what to do next. Most didn't ask questions. They knew better. The story had already written itself. And me? I still arrived at 9:04. Same walk, same thermos, same route through the side entrance, past the fourth floor coffee station, through the corridor with the flickering overhead light. But now, when I reached the elevator, I didn't stop at my old floor. My badge lit up green for the top level, the one with no number printed on the button. The one Jenna used to joke was just for the real decision makers. The floor where meetings didn't get booked through Outlook. They got summoned. My new desk was smaller than my old one. Cleaner, no monitors, just a touch screen, a legal pad, and a slim card reader that recognized me on contact. The title on the door wasn't flashy. Systems Architecture Liaison. But everyone knew what it meant, the same way they knew to check their permissions before touching anything with my watermark on it. I didn't gloat, didn't correct anyone. I didn't need to. The system did it for me. I spent my first Monday back reviewing vendor logs for the acquisition we'd approved. Arlen dropped by once, offered a short nod, and left without interrupting. Roslyn forwarded a compliance memo that began with, "Effective immediately, all contributor-owned IP must be reviewed through the original licensing trust." My name was in the footer. I never asked to be at the top. But now that I was there, I wasn't leaving. I didn't climb. I held the foundation steady until the tower collapsed. And when the dust settled, they realized I'd been carrying the load the whole time. So, no, I never raised my voice. Never argued in the meetings, never demanded credit. But when it mattered, when it finally mattered, every single line of my code raised its hand and pointed, and all I had to do was walk through the door they once tried to lock. Tell her it wasn't personal. She just shouldn't have laughed before reading the license terms.